the 11th, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it starts the 11th of July at 6 p.m.
So in here for stuff, presentation stuff.
Just
and
remain
then
on live now. Stop broadcast. Open. Start recording. When it says start recording, by the way, it's because the box records as well. If you want it to, you just put SD card in.
Oh, okay.
So don't be worried. It's saying that.
Huge one back here as well. It's like we're like day job plus freelance photographers. It's like
I'll probably end up leaving with all your stuff and you'll have it'll be very confusing.
it feels a lot brighter than I was hoping. I know why.
Hey. Never down. So we could just leave that. So in terms of setting the link, so I can just copy the link for that's the link for the live stream.
Just
Yeah, so I'll just
it's absolutely fine. I actually genuinely do.
share. That's probably a good button to click.
yeah.
Copy. So that's just the audio, no pressure. So what I have to do in terms of video recording now is hit record on that bad boy. Powers all in, settings are pretty much as they need to be.
This is the thing. So I had to say to downstairs, like, we are at capacity, we are on the list.
Yeah, there's no way we're getting on that network. That's why I said before to you, like, that's private, because that's what the guys struggle with. It's the event we did last year.
Right, okay.
Just kept falling over. It's horrible. As soon as we plug the wire in, done. Who's the person? Sure, please. Obviously, these wireless mics are just plugging in using. I think they should just ban these things. So they just fall out like.
Not very good.
I'm going to take them in.
Freedom, is it freedom?
There's about a 15-second lag, isn't there, something like that, with the
Oh, is there?
Oh yeah, me too. And
so I've just changed it, so
tidy, can you? It's just like, bum, then in the morning, she's like, oh, I'll go for this. I'll take it. Yeah.
yeah, there's someone walking in front. There's no one.
Just do a little time on your phone, walk in front. See how long it takes.
Oh, so then you can.
Oh, there you go, that's just updated the yeah, so just 1-2 minute, I reckon.
I'm just going to sneak it in.
I already told you about stories.
Bookshelf. Just for her jewelry by the sounds of things.
Right.
My earrings are cool.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, that's good. That's
Yeah.
a great idea.
I'll put it on to 8, I think that's 800 hours, so.
Your head to find ground.
I'm back to the 400 back to
You emailed so much.
Thank you so much.
so that's do anything else really without doing it. It's kind of play. It's just don't touch anything.
I know. Yeah. Thank you so much for doing this. Hello. Great to meet you. Thank you so much for stepping up. Yeah. Where did that was? It's so cool in here, isn't it? It's aircon. It's just like a nature. He was saying this. We've got like cracked up and stuff. I'm like, I know. Yeah, go on my quite hot. Quite hot. Something as well.
Yep.
Right.
Well, so just use there with the screen, it's a bit darker. Does that work for you? Yeah. Yeah, you're not going to touch it.
Yes, it's coming up better.
So much. Yeah. So hopefully.
One.
This is the
Okay.
So, hi. How are you? Hi.
Yeah, they turn the lights down.
something again.
So
They
cool.
put this for the screen then.
T-shirt, yeah. T-shirt's going to be no. Have you guys seen the before?
No,
Oh, perfect.
Should we give you one now?
Yep. Two.
Just use the toilet.
I want to see it as well.
Yeah. Yep. Two.
Excellent.
That's okay. So how long did it take you? Because you went to work to learn and stuff,
Over 5 years. Most, probably 2 years. I did a lot of live band stuff, not live and built this myself, and I know every single paper in there, it's perfect time. It's when you buy papers off Amazon, you know that they're great. So it's all perfectly made inside there. And then the other thing I had was a computer crash the other day. No, but I upgraded the computer, everything. I just spent money and then it worked. That's what that turned my phone. Yeah, build it yourself, spend money, and then have backups of everything. So this one's a backup, that's a backup, that's a backup, that, and then I've got a backup laptop.
So
I've got a backup me though.
yeah, that's it.
That's
You
you.
clone yourself.
Do you need any HDMI?
No, I think that's I just use the HDMI that I just I didn't know how the sound was going to be, so I thought just in case.
Oh, actually, thank you so much.
So I've got the headphones connected into the camera, so it's just plugged in.
Yeah, let's plug you in.
And then because it's people
No, I've done it. And they're not those kind of short, it's a bit more modern. So they're all done. And so, I do techno, so yeah, I do all the levels here.
Oh, okay.
It just sends a signal and that's it. That's it, yeah.
And then do you check like mobile just to watch it?
The stream, yeah. And just don't connect to the same network. Don't put this, leave that one alone.
Yeah, that's that one.
Don't
So
connect anything else.
that's connected to the guest one.
Yeah, the second.
Cool. Appreciate your help.
And you?
Getting to this point. Your webcam like that, because I tend to be fairly calm as well. I work with a photographer guy, he's a lovely guy, we get really well, but he's quite calm. I just can't deal with that.
Things go wrong with you. No, but obviously, there's some things you just can't fix. The internet didn't work. She definitely works. Travel
Yeah, someone tried the edition one wasn't even.
So yes, we'll mark up 3 of them to start with, and then the 2 people will just swap those 2, just put it in their pocket, the wire goes and they're ready. But if we can talk to them before they go on, and no like hitting of your chest.
Don't do that.
Yeah, I had someone that 2 days ago that for some reason he was at me or something like that.
Hi! I know. Are you happy?
Yeah, I am.
Oh, yeah, such a good Oscar as well.
Yes, it is.
And
Really
Depp,
funny.
the new one.
One.
This is like, yeah, there was some good journalists.
Yeah, James.
Yeah, and they're kind of. Well, yeah, and it's just built like a tech team.
She's probably going to come up just before we start.
Oh, I think that the tech team has a contact the tech team to the website.
Right, so what I'll do is I'll grab her,
Really.
point her your way, and then I'll just let her know that she's where you're lapel mic, and she'll see the handheld
It feels like it's
through speakers. Cool. And then I guess you guys will cover off the panels. Yeah, because all the panelists need to be held mic as well. So yeah, so what I've done is Who is looking after the panel? Do you know? Who's moderating?
Check. Who's moderating the panel?
Lillian.
Oh, okay, so we've actually got an additional chair we don't need it. Fine, we can take that away.
Yes.
So it's 4 panellists with
I had
Lillian
this,
as moderator,
don't know,
5
you
in
don't
total.
you? First time ever,
Yeah.
and I don't know if it's a setting I've changed. I went to go and change settings and it came up with a lock here,
Perfect. Yeah,
Never
so
ever
pick
seen
one of
that.
these chairs in.
but you can change it when you do that.
Yeah, so all these they're all on the 5.
It is just 5 that we need.
Oh, okay.
So we can away.
Okay.
Oh yeah, 6 chairs.
Yeah, really weird. I don't know what that is with the.
It's just a hardware lock button, is it?
Yeah, I've never seen that before. It's never come up with lock. So I feel. I mean, as long as I can change it, I can.
Charging battery.
Let's put another one in actually.
No, they're all on there. That's the microphones there. Just now figure out. No, look, because they're just, they're basically tape mics, but they're just a little bit lighter. Handhelds, you actually can just drop our handhelds. Thing is, they're just not labeled, so now to figure out which one's which. So that's a really good
It's often like a year out. And I think
Hello. Oh, that's good. Okay. Which name? Hold on.
quite a key question.
Sorry?
Got locked off.
Quickly adjusted it. It should be okay.
No, it made us.
It's just the white walls as well, but there's not too much white space.
It's the
We're
magic
too
question.
yellow, too yellow.
Yeah.
Are these the teas? Oh, that is
So exciting.
Contribute to the tonsil.
We are letting him start that same thing, so
I'm really conscious that you guys are filming and we're going to be like creeping around like mice to get them. Is that alright?
As long as it's not here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's all getting live streamed, so if you're alright being famous.
That was a dream.
Yeah.
Live streams. not like what I'm thinking. But I did think I was going to wear a dress. Yeah, and I was like, no. Something like no, Sarah, stuff that we do, I always have to think of.
Hello.
Today is the day!
It is.
You really feel
Finally.
like it.
How
After
are
our lunch and
I'm two, check, check, two, 1, 2. One, two, yeah. Sounding good, 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 good. 1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, yeah. 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2. 1, 2, 2, check, 2, 2. 1, 2, yeah. 1, 2, 2, check, check. 1, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. 1, 2, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2. One, 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 two, one, two, 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 one, two, 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 one, 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 two. You right? Turn through to your camera. Can you hear me now? Hello, hello, hello. Can you hear me? Hello.
Now that's shut off.
Yeah. Oh, is it stereo then? Is that? Best to test from the computer. Hello. Is it turned up?
Say again.
Is that turned up?
That's one of the problems. That won't work now unless we turn it off and turn it on again.
What's the code?
For the
One, two. One, two, check. Check in, mic. Mic check. Mic check. Mic. Mic check. Mic check. Mic check number one. Check-in number one. One, check. Check-in number one. Two, two. Mic number one. Mic number 1, stereo mix, test. Mic number 1, stereo mix, test. So are you part of the panel itself?
No, so I'm going to be quick intro and then.
So I'll need to take that mic back off you after that. And we'll give it to the person who's sitting far left, if you know who that is.
Okay, so what I might do. Wait, so who do you? Because I can't stay for very long.
That's fine, yeah, so as soon as you're finished, just take the mic off and give it to the person who's sitting on that first chair.
Oh, okay, fine.
Cool.
Yeah.
Straight away after you're done, stand it over.
Okay, that's what I'll do. I'll just take it off, stick it there, and then make my exit. Okay, perfect. Do you have everything you need? Water? You good?
That's it. Ready?
Yeah, okay. Hello. How are you? Nice to see you.
To see you.
The day is arrived.
The day is here.
No, it's exciting. Yeah, it's been great. Coverage and everything today.
again, and we'll have a proper drink once I'm done. So.
Absolutely.
Oh, good. Apparently, my quote was printed in City AM, and also got picked up by another financial something or other.
Well, yeah, maybe tea.
Oh, nice.
Look forward to it. Sounds great.
Good.
Yeah, because of data folks you haven't been able to make.
Fine. I'll get some. I'll get my EA.
That's perfect. Thank you.
I'm not resting.
Yeah.
Good, how are you?
First check.
Good to see you. I'm ready.
All right. As soon as those doors close, then we'll get started. All right. I think we're going to get started, everyone. If I can have your attention. Testing. Can you hear me? Woo. All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Erin Platts, head of Silicon Valley Bank for EMEA. On behalf of myself, James Downing, who's been really championing this work with us internally at SVB, and the rest of the team, we are really honored and delighted to be hosting you and helping to launch such an important piece of research. At Silicon Valley Bank, we work exclusively with innovation businesses of all sizes and all life cycles. And we also work really closely with the venture capital and private equity community. So sponsoring a piece of research like this where we can get data and increase transparency with the hope of really clubbing together to get some actionable decisions, results, is a really important thing for us. So shortly I'll be handing it over to Travis, who's going to dive into the detail and share some of the work. But before I do that, I just wanted to take a second and recognize the Diversity VC team. Lily, Czech, Ben, Travis. Sometimes we forget that they have very demanding day jobs, but what they do for the ecosystem and really for our industry is so very, very important. So thank you so much. We are really inspired by the work that you do, and we're really honored to be partnering with you. So thanks again. That's it from us at Silicon Valley Bank. Let me hand it over to Travis, who's going to get into the details.
Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you for such a warm welcome. And it's lovely to see such a diverse group of folks in the audience, so thank you so much for showing up. So I just wanted to take you on a bit of a story back to 2016 when our mission for data began. A group of venture capitalists, myself included, Lillian and Czech, were looking at the diversity of the VC industry, and we all came to the same conclusion that it felt like the industry was not that diverse. But actually, we couldn't really sort of put our finger on it. It was how non-diverse or how diverse was it? And so we basically set about doing our very first data study. It was called Women in UK Venture Capital, 2017. And for the very first time, we were able to provide a sort of reliable benchmark for the number of women working, men and women working in UK venture. And it basically proved that our hunch was correct. There was a lack of diversity, particularly when it comes to gender within UK venture. However, the scope of our report was limited exclusively to gender, and we've always wanted to push our work that bit further to discuss a broader set of diversity metrics. So it led us on to broadening our scope to what we have here today in this report. So in addition to gender, we've also started to look at the education background, the career background, and the ethnicity of UK venture capitalists. Like before, we've tried to provide the most comprehensive coverage of UK venture possible. So our scope covers 171 different VC firms and 2,114 employees. I hope you're all taking notes. There'll be a test at the end. And the key conclusions are these. On average, women represent about 30% of the UK VC labour force. And actually, this is improved on the 2017 number, where we saw 27% of the industry were women. When we compare this to benchmarks across sort of different sectors, we see that when compared with the UK average of 47%, actually sort of women are underrepresented within UK venture. But when we compare ourselves to sort of Level 20's report on PE, we're marginally ahead on average. And when we compare ourselves to tech directors, again, we're a little sort of kind of more representative than we see in tech. However, the numbers I show here are averages for everybody working in venture. So that includes everyone in an investment role and a non-investment role. If we look specifically at those who are in investment roles, these are people who are sort of making investment decisions sort of day in, day out, and sourcing companies and helping to push them through the sourcing process. We see that on average, 20% of investment professionals are women. Again, if we then dive one level further and look at senior investment professionals, and these are people who typically make decisions over investment deals, we see that on average, 13% are women, which gives us all pause for thought. So those were sort of averages across the overall industry. If we look on a firm-by-firm basis, we get the following picture, that actually 37% of firms have all male investment teams, so they don't have a single woman. And then also when we look at the number of firms without a senior woman on their team, we see that 63% of firms have no senior women on their investment team. So it's quite sobering stats, but at the same time, there is sort of reasons to be optimistic. And what we see at a junior and mid-level in venture is actually there's been a significant improvement in the number of women in the industry. And we see sort of 37% of junior analysts and investment professionals are women. So I mentioned our study also goes beyond gender, and we started to look at education. And what we see is actually there's a relatively high level of education within venture, which I suppose comes as no surprise. When you need to be making decisions about finance and law and thinking about sort of commercial experience, it's, I suppose, to be expected that you would expect a high level of education within the industry. We see 16% have been to Oxford and Cambridge, and 28% have been to the Russell Group. But I think when we dived a little bit into more detail on the industry, we looked at specific institutions, and we see that actually there's a relatively non-diverse pool from which VCs are graduating. So we see that actually a third of VC professionals have come from one of Oxford, Cambridge, Stanford, Harvard, or a business school. And for all of those who are so kind of mathematically inclined, the numbers don't add up to a third. There's a bit of overlap. So you get some of the business schools actually graduating from Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, or Stanford. So you have a bit of a Venn diagram. And another interesting stat which stood out to me was the fact that sort of women venture capitalists typically have a higher level of education than men. And this goes for the number of degrees that women have got. But also to the sort of at the junior, mid, and senior level, the percentage of employees with a postgraduate research degree, such as a PhD, is actually higher for women than it is for men. When we looked at the career background, again, there was a degree of sort of non-diversity, as it were, and we see that sort of 4 in 10 venture capitalists come from a general finance background, such as sort of accountancy or such like, an investment banking background or consultancy. There's a sort of also, if we then go to entrepreneurial experience, we see it's a stark contrast. So whilst 4 in 10 come from a sort of a corporate background, I suppose, we see that only 8% come from a startup or have experience in a startup, and only 4% have experience in tech, such as Facebook or Google or Apple. And lastly, I wanted just to present some of our provisional or sort of early work and findings on ethnic minorities. We did a survey of, we got sort of 307 responses, of which we believe there were about 223 who are actually relevant to venture capital. And we showed that 76% of the industry is white. Now, when we were thinking about sort of how do we benchmark this data, we had a bit of a debate as to what was the most relevant benchmark. And we came to the conclusion that it was actually the London average which was most relevant in this example, because 72% of all funding happens here in London. So when we compare our VC data with that of London, we see that 59% of London is white, compared to 70% in the venture industry. And when we look at those from ethnic minority backgrounds, we see that sort of venture is underrepresenting those from ethnic minorities. So I don't want to dive too much into the conclusions, because I know Lillian has got a great sort of group of panelists who are going to hopefully dive into the detail and maybe explain some of the stories behind this data. But I just wanted to leave you with a few closing thoughts just to sort of tee up that discussion. So I think for me, the exciting thing is that change is happening. It's really positive to see that representation of women at sort of junior and mid-level is improving. And our hope is that that will continue, that there will be an increasing number of senior investment women in the industry, and hopefully across other diversity metrics. I think our other observation was that there has been a change in the discussion and the dialogue and the sort of sophistication around the discussion of diversity. And I hope sort of some of our research is an example of that we have extended our work beyond just the discussion of gender into other diversity areas. But we need to go further, and we hope to be continuing to evolve and lead that discussion to make sure change continues to happen and happens sustainably. But I also want to sort of leave a little bit of information about how diversity can improve performance. You'll see in the report that we've put in references to a number of different publications which show that diversity can improve performance. Gender and ethnic diversity, McKinsey say, is related positively to profitability. We also showed that investment teams with a diverse educational background are 11.5% more likely to realize a successful exit. And entrepreneurial experience also is a key indicator of success within the industry. So if we can encourage those from sort of more diverse backgrounds, hopefully we can also see an improvement in performance for all of our firms. But the last point I wanted to leave you with was a discussion of how inclusion matters in addition to diversity. Inclusion means better teams, it means better decisions, it means better cohesion within a group, and hopefully it means better performance results. I think inclusion is super important for our industry. And I don't think we've done enough in this particular report to really discuss the idea of inclusion. We've got much more to do. So I hope we can sort of push forward, understand how sort of we can make sort of inclusion a more central part of our discussion. And I hope you'll join me on the journey. Thank you very much. Before I hand over the mic to Lillian, I do have to say a huge thank you to a few folks. So if you will just permit me. Firstly, a huge thanks to the folks at Silicon Valley Bank. Absolutely, rightly so. Silicon Valley Bank have been incredibly generous supporters of Diversity VC and this particular research report, and have also been excellent hosts. So thank you so much for your time and for your support. I also need to say thank you to all of the firms who participated in the study. It's been a huge amount of work on behalf of the firms, making sure that our data is reliable and provides a reliable benchmark for industry, and also for their engagement in the discussion full stop. I also wanted to put this in just to show the sort of the wealth of people who got involved in this report. I haven't actually had a chance whilst going through all the data analysis to count the number of people who've been involved, but I'm sure it's upwards of 50. And then when you think of all of the friends and family and loved ones who have also helped support our collaborators, it has been a genuinely heroic effort from the team. So thank you to you all for making this possible. And our final thank you is to all of you for coming along, for being our supporters, and for being such a friendly audience. It's been incredibly exciting, and there's a huge energy in the room. And I can't wait to see how the discussion pans out with Lillian.
There was a moment where we mic up, and I'm also going to Travis, so I will be reading from my phone. And then you recite it. So I'm very because. Good, fantastic. I'm going to try to crouch down here. Okay, hopefully everyone can hear me. Good, fantastic. Well, thank you again so much for making the time today and coming. Is the mic okay? Good stuff. I would like to thank Travis, who's too humble to actually make the point, so I will, because so much of the heavy lifting today and for the report has been done by Travis, so can we all first off start with a round of applause? And then my second thank you is to the panelists tonight, who's been very kind to share their time and their amazing insights with us. So without further ado, I'm going to sort of introduce them in a slightly different ad hoc order. So we start off with Saranga, who is a general partner at Balderton, one of Europe's leading early-stage venture capital funds. And before venture capital, he was both an engineer and an entrepreneur. Second is Kate, who is CEO and co-founder of Applied, the behavioral insight team's first tech venture. Behavioral insight team, for those who might be in the know, is the UK's kind of nudge institutions, public policy think tank. And Applied is a web platform that uses behavioral and data science to help organizations find the best person for the job, regardless of their background. And prior to founding Applied, Kate was principal advisor and head of growth at the Behavioral Insight team, as well as working for UNESCO Southeast Asia and the Australian Treasury. So thank you, Kate. Alice is the MD for Strategy, Economics and Business Development for the British Business Bank, which is the UK's domestic development bank, as well as the largest institutional investor in the UK venture capital landscape, and has worked in collaboration with Diversity VC on prior projects such as venture capital funding for female founders. And Tunde is an intern from our inaugural Future VC program and has a background in investment banking, startup, and law. And I myself, very, very quickly, I'm a co-founder of Diversity VC, and my day job is at Abrams Ventures. So, first jumping straight into it, kind of for the entire group, we've just gone through the results of the report. Any first actions?
Well,
I'm gonna pick on you, Alice.
Oh, here we go. All right. I mean, I think I'm on the record as saying that although I was a bit disappointed, I wasn't exactly surprised. I mean, the numbers have moved a bit from 17, but they're still. I mean, we all know that the venture capital industry doesn't move that fast, right? I mean, when you're locked into a fund for at least 10 years, how quickly does the team change? And as an LP, we don't want teams to change that much, so you're just not going to see. Massive jumps driven in every couple of years, but the data was still, positive directionally.
Fantastic. Kate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sobering, right? Like, considering the sheer power that VCs hold in the economy, I mean, they make decisions about which kinds of businesses are likely to survive that very early stage, right? If you think about the volume of deals that potentially come through a VC, make decisions which end up being consequential. They decide who becomes the next Google or Facebook or whatever it might be. So I think the fact that we still see such a dearth of diversity within that group is problematic, though, as you say, there's this sort of movement from junior to mid. So my query would be, for those of you who are in VC, what does it look like to think about opening up the decision-making capabilities of a VC to involve people who might be sitting at more junior levels of your organization, but might nevertheless boost the diversity of the people in the room and the perspectives that are on offer, including Tunde and others?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of echo both of those comments, I think. The bit that the data doesn't capture, which I think is worth sharing, at least from my own experiences, is that what really has changed is the nature and the frequency of this conversation topic within firms, which obviously happen in closed doors, and you're not necessarily always aware of it from the outside. But I joined the industry about 5 years ago, maybe almost 6 now, and in the last year or two, there's been a marked increase in people thinking about this, talking about this, and that includes people who I think hadn't really considered it at all previously. Sometimes that's for sort of negative reasons, but in a way, it doesn't matter. The point is that it's being addressed, and I think that's a huge improvement. And it's a difficult thing to capture in data, obviously, because it's a private piece of information. But to me, at least, it actually gives me quite a lot of confidence that, while it's slow and sort of frustratingly slow, I totally agree with Alice's point on that, I do think it is changing, and I don't think it's going away. It hasn't gotten quieter in the last 6 months, it's only gotten noisier. So, and I think actually the report is really important that way, because once a year it reminds us all that we haven't, our work is not yet done. So that's powerful.
So I guess I echo a lot of the points made earlier. One of the things which surprised me the most, given what VCs like to talk about, is actually the relative dearth of people with like tech and entrepreneurial backgrounds in VC. I was like extremely shocked. There's only like 4% for like tech and 8% for startups, because given like the amount of messaging that you get in podcasts, etc., about founders being essentially the future of VC, it just seems like an extremely low number. The other thing I got from reading the report, which wasn't in the stats, which was quite interesting, was around the kind of proportion of like ethnic minorities, etc., within venture capital. It was surprising to note that a lot of funds, I think, chose not to answer that question. I think there was like a comment about that, which is, I view it as, like a negative thing, obviously, but it suggests that there's like some kind of sense of shame around that, which at least shows that attitudes are hopefully changing, and maybe you'll see action in the short to medium term.
Yeah, just to sort of pick up on that, I think because due to GDPR reasons, we had to go and ask people directly about their ethnicity, but you are still right in the fact that people choose to respond or not. And of course, it's actually only about 10% of funds actually answered. So we actually think there's actually an over-reporting in the ethnicity because we think, just anecdotally, when you think about, does it sound about right that 1 in 4 investors is an ethnic in London VC? That is really not the case. So I think the actual picture for ethnic makeup of diversity in VC is actually lower due to this kind of self-reporting aspect. But yeah, very much echo that sentiment of people, and that's the topic people don't even want to go near, right? Like gender, you sort of have to sort of address, but to Saranga's point, we are at a slow changing industry and analysis point, and we are sort of taking snapshots of a very slow flow. And at this point in time, lots of things are sort of beginning to be talked about, but probably not quite where we hope it to be. Which kind of also leads me on to my kind of second question, which is now that we're sort of trying to broaden the conversation with looking at the different dimensions of diversity, not just gender, but education, career history, and ethnicity. But even in the report itself, these things are looked at in silos and not really when we consider, the person in front of us when they're interviewing as a whole person. So how do we think about that factor? To ask it another way, how do we think about the intersectionality of the candidates? How do we think about, someone from a state school background who might be male, but, might have other dimensions of diverse characteristics versus someone else who has a different part of diverse characteristics? How do we think about including them and ranking them and sort of prioritizing them?
Ooh, I don't think I would want to rank like, oh yeah, I'm more diverse than you are, mate. Like, really? Do we really want to go there?
Diversity's full.
Intersectionality is obviously a thing, but at the same time, I do struggle with it because I do think that people are individual. So just as an example, just to be controversial, okay? So life sciences. I think one of the reasons why the numbers are better for gender in VC in the UK is because life science is actually a much bigger percentage of the VC ecosystem here and the investment opportunities than strict tech, okay, than just the Valley. And life sciences has always been traditionally, for decades, the quote female science, and you have a long pipeline of very senior women in the life sciences sectors from big pharma and so on. You also have, not to put too fine a point on it, loads of Asians, right? And so, come on, like, sorry, Asian, I can say this. Like, my mom was like, grow up and be a doctor, right? Thanks, I'm not. And but she's like, okay, she'll marry one.
True. Yeah, exact same thing for my kind of Asian as well. just to be transparent, yeah.
But the point is that I think that if you look at life sciences and you look at entrepreneurs in the life sciences field and you look at all of that, I would expect to see more Asians from, highly educated backgrounds, state school or not, who consulting or not, and who started businesses and then sort of go into VC. And I think that's very different from, say, the tech world, where in theory it should be the same, right? But it's not. And that's what I struggle with. I think if you're in life science in certain sectors of venture capital, it's easier to be intersectional, or at least certain permutations of intersectional than it is others.
Yeah, I think the interesting point about intersectionality, and I'm so glad that the debate has shifted from single dimensions of diversity, because none of us is explained by anyone. In fact, even the combination of dimensions of traditional diversity don't explain our lived experience, which can really differ in ways which are hugely important. As an example, we have people in our team who have levels of diversity we don't even currently measure accurately well. And I think one of the challenges with intersectionality, even if you care about it, I take your point, Alice, but even for people who want to be able to understand, is there a different experience for people who have multiple forms of diverse backgrounds and therefore might have multiplicative levels of privilege or not? and how that might reflect their experience, you then find yourself in a challenging problem, which I'm sure you did through the report, which is you get to quite small numbers quite quickly, and then you face a really genuine challenge around not wanting to put people into categories where they're identifiable. And particularly when you get into small numbers, like we would be in the VC industry, you then start talking about basically an individual, and they cannot be the representation of all of their multiple types of diversity. So surely the answer to all of this is data is always helpful. Being sensitive about how individuals' data is used to help answer those kinds of questions. And I hope that we are, 5 years hence, beyond talking about just gender or ethnicity or educational background, but we have not only added more dimensions of diversity to that conversation, but maybe have better language for talking about these kinds of things. And I count myself as a platform provider in this space as someone who needs to think very deeply about this and needs to lean on people who have strong views on this to help us do that in a kind of sophisticated way.
Something that I found quite interesting and kind of came up when I was reading this report in my thoughts is that I hear a lot of people describe VC as an apprenticeship industry. So when you come in as an analyst or associate, you basically don't have a clue what's going on, which to an extent means that maybe barring life sciences or something with like deep tech, you could theoretically pick anyone. So essentially, like the associate pool of VCs is essentially self-selecting and replicating themselves. So because that is the nature of the role, most people haven't been investing in startups for the past 10 years before they become a VC associate. Because that's the nature of the role, I think, kind of any heightened awareness of at least trying to create like a representative picture of the city you're in or the country you're in just would be extremely helpful. And intersectionality is obviously part of that, but it just is very difficult to create. You can't, for example, very easily say, okay, you're discriminating because this person has this set of skills, but you pick the other guy who has that set of skills because essentially, at least from what I understand, there is no particular set of skills. So it's quite hard to be objective, and figuring out a way to solve that, or to solve for that, kind of like the work that Applied is doing, is extremely interesting.
Yeah, so it's interesting you say that. If I pick up on that apprenticeship thing, which I've also heard a lot, I think so obviously there's a macro thing here where, in general, positions of privilege in business and other spheres haven't been very well represented by a variety of different types of people over the last few decades, and centuries, and we're seeing that change a little bit now. But on a micro level, if you look at venture, I really, really think that what we're really seeing is venture grow from being a very small, very insider club kind of cottage industry into one that is massive and globally much, much more important than it ever was before. And that's basically because technology is taking the same journey, right? Tech 20, 30 years ago was a fairly niche, esoteric topic. It mattered to a small number of people. Yes, some fortunes were made, but it wasn't something that touched everybody's lives. That's not the case today, right? We are all carrying essentially a mini supercomputer in our pockets. We all use it constantly. We use it more than we look at that screen more than we look at other people's eyes, it turns out, in the latest research I've seen for people in the age of 16 to 25. So, it's just tech's prevalence and ubiquity is mind-blowing. And with that, what's happened is, huge amounts of capital get forced into tech because it wants to pursue that return that can be gained from being part of this really important wave of things that are changing. And that means that the people, the very privileged people who get to choose where that money goes, i.e. the venture capitalists, suddenly are under a spotlight that I don't think they ever were before. And if you look at venture in Silicon Valley, 30 years ago, and look at maybe the second generation of venture capitalists, probably the biggest determiner of whether you were a VC in the second generation was whether your dad was one in the first generation. I mean, and I'm not joking, like many very well-known, very famous, including some very successful VCs, their main skill at the job on day one was that dad did it, and they didn't really have the imagination to go and do anything else. And so I think that's what it was like. And if you go into any tiny enough industry, that's probably the case, right? But it's no longer a tiny industry. It's huge. It really, really matters, to the point that you made earlier. It's going to impact everybody's lives. And by the way, to be really good at it, I think you need to understand a lot of the world, because it impacts all these people. They're all going to use that tech in different ways. If you all come from a very, very small subset of reality, then you're not going to understand how it can impact other things. You're going to miss opportunities. So I think we're living through that change. And I think that the idea that it's apprenticeship industry, the idea that it's something that you can sort of turn up at and not really know much about and just be a smart kid who then learns from your dad or your dad's mate, is going to go. And I think we're going to see more specialization. I think we're going to see much more educated people do it. We're going to see people who've really trained and learned about the industry or other industries that are relevant to it come into it. So diversity is a really important topic. It's obviously what we're here for today, but the general professionalization of venture is something that's part of all of this, which I for one, I'm really excited about. I think it's going to be a much better industry in 20 years' time with many more thoughtful people who are there for a real reason, rather than that they just stumbled into it because they knew the right people when they were 18.
Can I step in and just do a really brief plug? So the British Business Bank did a piece of work on what makes a good venture capitalist, and we published it in June, relatively quietly. But one of the things, I want to pick up on this professionalization of venture capital thing, because it turns out actually the most important skills you need to be a venture capitalist are not actually the technical ones. They're the people ones, they're the soft ones. They're convincing the entrepreneur to, do what you suggest, particularly when it's going against what they want, and to be able to negotiate a win-win situation in terms of your term sheets. And it's actually a lot of human skills. And so one of the things that we're proposing is there is actually a program that's being launched at London Business School. The current operating name is the Newton program, and it's basically based off of the Kaufman Foundation program out in Palo Alto. But the whole idea is that you shouldn't have to fly all the way to the Valley to get that cohort and to get that kind of development. Because we know, based on this work, that the average VC firm is only about 9 people. And that's just way too small to be able to have a full-time HR training and development sort of thing, right? And that's where the apprenticeship sort of comes in. And that's great, but it might not be quite enough. And in terms of the UK, we'd like to make sure that we can have cohorts, be diverse, learn from each other. And I think that's something for the longer term.
Great, and that leads me really nicely into my third question. It's almost like I shared the question with you guys beforehand, which definitely did not happen. But something that Alice said that I thought was incredibly interesting was that for the UK economy, diversity can become a point of long-term differentiation. In the tech ecosystem, in the perhaps venture community, and I sort of just want to put that again to the panel to sort of say, do you think, what are your kind of reflections on this, and is that a sustainable competitive advantage that UK in particular can achieve? Okay.
Well, I mean, you presented some of the data on the power of diversity. So, I mean, increasingly, we saw that most of the early research on diversity and the performance of teams was correlational. It seemed to say that, there seems to be something that's happening with people who are more diverse in their teams. But what's great is that we now are getting underneath that to actually show that there's a positive causal mechanism. So it's not just by chance that those teams that are more diverse perform better, it's because of them being more diverse. And you showed the Gompers study that was done a few years ago that showed the more likely that it is that you had women in your investment team, the more successful the investment fund was, by metrics that are pretty huge, actually, considering it's an industry where the margins between the best performing funds and the average or even failing funds are actually tiny. So I would like to think that we are not that far off being able to say it's pretty clear that diversity drives great performance, so long as, and it's really fantastic that you drew the point that it's not just diversity, it's also inclusion. So how do you actually bring multiple types of voices into conversations rather than just having face diversity? That's a hugely important part of it, and you cultivate the right kinds of conversations in a fund. But we should not be re-prosecuting the business case for diversity. We should then be able to say, okay, cool, how do we make that our advantage? Well, Suranga made the point, if we're going to be selling products to the greatest possible market out there, well then definitely it's going to be a competitive advantage if we're already ahead of the rest of the game on making sure that we have people who have an eye to what does it look and feel like to be a person who's different from your average using this product, and what are the questions we're not asking in product design, What are the questions that we could avoid? What are the reputational risks that we could avoid by not designing a product with a single person, single user in mind?
Great, thank you. And do we have time for questions at all? We do. Does anyone have a question? Go for it. Go. Damn. Okay, that did not work out as anticipated.
Hi, I'm Jim Dyer. Thanks for your comments earlier. So in the stats, I didn't get a chance to flip through fully, but I wonder what the statistic would be for the diversity for managing partners in VCs. So I'm not sure what that is, but I'd like to ask Alice, what do you think the role of the LP is in changing that?
Oh, the LP is totally on the hook. I mean, at the end of the day, VCs are managing our money, right? So, in fact, Chuck and I were in New York in April, and we had, how much was it? Something like 3 trillion AUM sort of in the room. Yeah, at the British Ambassador's sort of residence. Closed doors, of course. And all we talked about was this, yeah? And there's, on the practical perspective, there's the ILPA, sort of template about questions to be asked. Now, it's low-hanging fruit. I mean, it's like your bare minimum. Like, do you have a sexual harassment claim, Sorry, I laugh, but believe it or not, that wasn't being asked before. You have to take a risk-based approach. But it is moving, and we think the LP world cares, but it's reasonably conservative, I think it's fair to say. And so, it's, questions will be asked, but what happens is, what are the answers from the fund managers coming back? I don't know the answers on the managing partner question, though. Does Travis?
We have the investment committee breakdown in the report, but I think it only looks at it in the dimension of gender, if I'm correct, right?
So I do remember, for me, is 83% of investment committees didn't have a single woman in them?
Yeah.
And then combined with the previous research, which is that, so we did investment committee, people who went to investment committee, 25% of investment committees didn't see a single female the whole year, not one. Yeah, I know, right? So the point is that when you show up and you're a female, you don't look like, I think I'm on the record as calling them a white tech bro, and I've dated them, so they're nice, okay? But the thing is that when you don't look like that, and they haven't seen anybody who didn't look like that for the last year, and there's no one who doesn't look like that in the room, it just feels riskier because you're the exception. And so, given that this is a high-risk area, I think it's not even unconscious bias. It's actually pretty a normal human response to go, wow, I'm seeing something that I normally don't see. That feels higher risk, okay? And then you sort of make your decisions accordingly.
The question is how do you be proactive and try against that natural tendency?
So one of the things about sort of this work, and Chuck and I have had long conversations about this, is I actually think that some of the best VCs that are working in this field are all guys. It's about how you think, right? And although I do think greater diversity in the funds is absolutely essential, I don't want to let everybody else off the hook. Also, I know how slowly it moves, so I don't want to wait until we have full equality in the VC sort of teams, right? I want change now. And it's possible. And what it is about being conscious and, being aware and sort of asking questions and going, is there objectively more risk or is it just a perception of risk?
Sorry? Just to that point, just to give a very explicit example of just of one, my firm. We did a 3-year program where we had someone sit in and essentially encode and mark all of our conversations around investment decisions. in order to understand how each of us makes decisions and why, what sort of axes of consideration we each take as individuals. And then what we did with that was we would report that back to the individual, but also to everyone in the group. And this wasn't about diversity necessarily. It was actually mainly about trying to understand what our typical biases are as individuals, and which of the other partners in the investment committee think similarly to you, which ones think differently to you. And then obviously from that you can do all kinds of things. You can choose to change your opinions. You can think, oh, I never considered the founder, I should consider the founder more, or I never considered the market, I should do that more. But you can also do things like think, well, I know I think a lot like that person, therefore I should really go and ask this other person first because he or she's going to challenge me a lot more in my early thinking, for example. So, we've done that very explicitly and very consciously, and it's had a dramatic impact on the way we talk about decision making. And then separately, we also do unconscious bias training on a regular basis with the whole firm, and particularly the investment team. We do it more frequently. And that's one of those things where the reality is everybody has it. There are plenty of brown female VCs who will still pick white bros as entrepreneurs, right? It's not necessarily about always choose like or anything like that. It's just not that simple, right? And so I think the only way to really, yes, you want to try and make things more representative of reality, but in addition, every one of us, however many diversity boxes any individual can check, you need to be aware of the fact that you have those biases and confront them, and do that on a regular basis. And you'll never be perfect, but I think if you do that consciously, you can be a lot better.
Diversity affects the actual startup industries in. You see it's predominantly dominated by white tech bros. And is that a consequence of the lack of representation of VC? Do you think it's like a circular problem? What's your reason?
This is a tad anecdotal, but over like the last 2 or 3 years, I've been working with a few startups from kind of the community where I'm from, so it's just like around East London, all 3 of which are like run by like black founders. And I mean, in terms of just trying to get access to capital, it's kind of unbelievable, and that's to an extent like an effect of like the socioeconomic circumstances of like that part of London. But things like angel investors don't even exist in these people's universe. So it's kind of crazy. I've been at like Local Globe for a week and. For 3 weeks, sorry. And we're at the seed stage, which sounds extremely early, but you talk to the company, and they've already raised 500 grand. Obviously, these are like selected startups, but like even the bottom end of the funnel, just to kind of get funds to start your idea, no one or very few people from Stratford or East London are going to be able to raise like a friends and family round of 100 grand, like from who? Already, like even at the top of the funnel, you can't even really get going in that way, no matter how good your idea is. I think that's already one thing, and then I guess like the next kind of stage is quite interesting insofar as VCs do really love a warm intro. I understand why. It means you have to do slightly less work, and it just also means I've seen the volume of inbound that VCs receive. But that kind of qualified lead thing, kind of implicitly discriminates against people who are not in your bubble or in your network. So that's another thing, and that's I guess one of the impacts on one of the second order impacts on founders. So even if you do manage to somehow get a friend and family round, like your chances of being able to get in front of like a good seed fund are diminished. The other thing, which is like on the other side of this equation, is like once in the relationship with like the VC firm, I've like at Local Globe, I've seen them do some pretty amazing stuff. So we have like regular meetings. I think every 90 days we meet the company, and I've seen our partners just straight up ask a company, like, what are you doing for diversity and inclusion? And so just having VCs who are conscious of that, especially at that early stage, can really, kind of set the tone on hiring. And like when I came on board on the internship, I didn't expect to see that. I definitely didn't expect to see it multiple times in like 3 weeks. And really, I've often seen like some of these founders just be completely shocked by the question, not from a kind of like resistance perspective, but they just had not thought about it. They just, got out their Rolodex or the proverbial one and found, the 5 people they were in school with, and just kind of never widened their search after, outside of that.
Follow-up. So do you think that maybe there needs to be a sort of, as opposed to constantly looking at warm leads and focusing on that, focusing on the cold leads and doing an exercise where you say, we want to look at a number of the cold leads who are diverse and come from a range of backgrounds, and we'll do a mix of something.
Oh yeah, there's out of the Valley, there's this whole concept of office hours. I mean, that's open to everyone. I mean, it's a little sort of X factor, but it does actually work because it opens it, it makes it a bit more accessible for people who don't have the warm leads, and it's one of the things I know some of the
Yeah, we do office hours,
Yeah.
so I agree with everything you said, and in particular the thing about it being easier to go with warm leads. But the reality is, venture is about finding outliers, right? So actually, you're being a pretty rubbish, pretty lazy VC if you're relying entirely on that. And so our single most valuable company today in our entire portfolio is a company called the Hut Group that emailed us completely cold via the inbound@balderton.com email address. So it's one of these ones that was just one of the many hundreds, as you say, that sort of come into the inbox. And luckily, one of our team was going through all of them and thought this company sounded interesting and got on a train, went to Manchester, which is where the company is, dug into it, thought it was really interesting, brought it back, and then we ultimately invested. And today that company's worth somewhere between $3 and $5 billion. So I think it's a great example of a company where it was never part of the classic networks that exist around London venture. And thank goodness we responded to that cold email. I don't know whether they sent that email to other firms, but if they did and they ignored it, then they lost out. So I do think that good VCs do actually try to figure out ways to break out of the obvious networks and go into unobvious ones. But it is hard work and it takes more effort. And so we're trying it both inbound and outbound. So office hours actually is surprisingly powerful that way. We get a really interesting, very different set of people who come and talk to us. Not all of whom obviously are ones we'd want to invest in, but that doesn't matter, I don't think. It also helps spread the message further. So I always think, sure, we might have 10 people come in and only one of them really has an idea that's investable for us, but the other 9 probably go and tell someone else that's a bit like them from their part of society about what we do, and it could be one of those that's the next great company.
Yeah, I also sort of want to pick up on this and say it depends on the stage at which you're looking at, and at least for Series B, which 8 Rows invests in, we definitely do a lot of outbounds, right? Because the idea, which is implicit if a VC has given you the lead, well, there's 2 questions. First of all, if it's so good, why are you giving it to me, right? If it's like so good, why aren't you doing it yourself? And then the second one is, even if it's good and you can't do it for whatever reason, that probably means they're talking to the market and we're a bit too late to the process. And therefore, that is that additional competitive drive to go and talk to companies proactively to try to find the best companies first and build a relationship with them ahead of time. Great. I think we had a question there.
Hello, my name's Isaiah. I'm also at Local Globe. So my question is, what is our role as diversity interns in this whole process? What can we do to make your lives easier? And the context behind that question is, Tunde and I, we've been really inspired by what Local Globe is doing on the ground. Like today we had a school in from the local area and we spent a couple of hours talking to them about what VC is, and that's happened pretty much every week.
Yeah, like every 2 days.
I'm speaking at another school on Monday on behalf of Local Globe, and I think it's so powerful for students at these schools to see people that they can aesthetically identify with and who have a similar background to them but haven't allowed these statistics to put them off. So what can we do to support you guys?
I'm just dying. I'm so sorry to do another plug. Okay. This is money. Okay, so you know how we talked about how some folks don't have friends and family rounds because their friends and family don't have the money? So there's a thing called startup loans. Okay, it's personal loan up to £25,000. Two of y'all can get it together, so £50,000 total. Okay, it's a capped interest rate at 6%. It's disproportionately for women, people from minority backgrounds. There's a whole program for folks who've been in long-term unemployment, and it comes with loads of mentoring and pre-app support and sort of post support. And so when you talk to the people that you guys know in your communities and sort of, about starting up a business, and not all of them are going to be VC, right? I mean, some of them will just be okay growth. They're not the take over the world types, and that's totally cool. There is actually support out there. There is money available, right? And when these things work, they absolutely transform lives. They really do. And yeah, we lose money on it, but that's cool because the positive sort of results of the lives and the families that are transformed are totally worth it. And yes, I have an econometric model that says that. So, and that's how I can continue to get government funding for it. But it is one of those things that we wish more people sort of knew about because entrepreneurialism, VC is great. Having a company that will take over the world is awesome, but entrepreneurialism is for everyone, right?
I think actually what you're doing already, by the sounds of things, is exactly what I hope you can do. I mean, look, the reason I'm a huge fan of the Future VC project. I think it's one of the most exciting things that we're doing at Diversity VC right now. And for me, that's because, like I sort of said before, I think venture capital is a massively opaque industry. A lot of people don't even know it exists, don't know what it's about, and have no idea of how it works. And the fact that we're letting whatever it is now, 30 or 40 people from very, very different backgrounds who are not necessarily the kind of people who'd stumble into VC, get a ringside seat on that is really, really powerful. But that's just, whatever it is, 30 or 40 people. I would love for that to be 3,000 or 4,000 people. So if there's one thing you can do, I think it's to continue to transmit the message of how this industry basically works. Like it's as simple as, so I was in my kids' school, which, is a state school around the corner from my house the other day, and I go in and talk to the year sixes, so they're 9, 10 years old, and we talked, and so I showed them a pitch deck. I showed them the YouTube Series A pitch deck, which actually is on the web. You can go and see it because it's part of a lawsuit. Which is and not relevant to this story, but an interesting story separately. But anyway, and every kid in that room, of course, knows what YouTube is, right? And spends way too much time on YouTube. And so I sort of said, well, do you all know what YouTube is? And then you can start asking them questions and dig into this. And you realize they don't know what YouTube is. Is YouTube a company or is it like a thing that's there? Where is it? How does it work? Does it make money? How does it make money? Who owns it? Who controls it? Who gets to choose what's... they don't know any of those things. And actually over an hour or two, because they're inquisitive 9, 10-year-olds, they realize that this is a fascinating topic and they dig into it. And through that, I spent an hour with them talking about how actually YouTube was set up by these 3 guys, and they were in California, and then they went to these other guys called Sequoia, who gave them some money, and then they built this thing. And did you know they sold it to Google? Did you know that Google, and it's amazing how only 5% of them know that Google owns YouTube, which is interesting in and of itself, in my opinion. But anyway, so I think that is the key thing. Any of us who know the secret of VC or tech or how it works, should, whenever we can, just talk about it to other people. And it doesn't have to be children, it can be, grandparents to children, it can be people who are, brown, black, white, and everything in between. It can be men and women. Just express it. Because right now it's a very hidden, secretive industry. And because of that, those who know join it and get into it and influence it and enjoy and reap the benefits of it. But there's no reason why it should be just those people who get to do that. And for what it's worth, I don't think it does as well as it could do because it's so limited. So if you can do that wherever you walk, that will be a fantastic thing.
The only other thing I would add is, well, one, I totally agree. I think you're already doing the things. Most of the science around debiasing suggests that seeing is believing. So you going in there and literally being seen it's in and of itself statistically likely to be making an impact. The other thing I would add is, and this comes a little bit, selfishly from my perspective as a founder, you might hear from my accent that I'm not British. I came from public sector. I had zero connections into the VC world. So I had many, many other areas of privilege, but I didn't know the first thing about VC. And what, people really pay attention. I went to office hours I looked on VC websites for those that were willing to actually share their term sheets. Like the amount of publicly available information, and I think, but it has to be publicly available information that the VCs that you want to speak to are willing to share themselves. Because if it's just like, oh yeah, there's the BVCA standard out there, but actually no one uses it, that's not helpful if you're trying to understand a sector that you don't understand. And so I really call out VCs that go that extra mile to sort of remove some of the informational asymmetry that inevitably exists for those of us outside of the net. You know, because you don't have maybe anyone in your network that can explain some of the basic terms. I know it sounds embarrassing, but it took me, I mean, I'm willing to say it took me like 1.5 years to understand the basics of how like fundraising worked. And I had to learn that the hard way. You know, if I'd had someone in my network that knew it, you know, beautifully from day one, I would have been hugely advantaged by that. So I think, you know, it sounds like Local Globe's doing loads of great stuff in this space. And I would just say to them and to anyone else in the room who's in a position of power that to the extent that you can increase the level of transparency about how the industry works, that will probably also disproportionately help people who are most likely to be disadvantaged from that.
I think I'll just chime in with my 2 cents based on the fact that I also kind of taught you guys for a very brief session. And it was quite interesting, right? Because I got you guys to ask due diligence questions. And something that stood out to me was we started off the Diversity Future VC program with the idea that we will get diverse folks to come in and they will give their diverse perspective into the VC process. And something that stood out, at least in a very snapshot to me, was people were still using a very standard VC framework to look at the things. And I know why that is, because every single thing that you read on the internet tells you about these are the SaaS metrics, these are what a typical founder looks like. And to sort of echo something Saranga said earlier, you know, if you do get into VC and you stay in VC, don't be the person who then still do exactly what another VC would have done. You know, like use your perspective to sort of ask, how do I think about something differently from everyone else, and how do I sort of retain that rather than try to change yourself to fit in what the existing mode of VC is. You would, like the future VCs were not brought in to conform to what the VC is now. You were brought in to change what VC is going to be. Right.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
All right. Any other questions? Okay.
So I work in the DMI space as well, and one of the challenges, going back to what Lillian was saying earlier about a lot of the time VCs are like 9 to 10 people. Kind of have the same struggle with accelerators as well, and they don't have the infrastructure or just the manpower to be able to execute long-term DMI strategies. So like, how do you envision small organizations that aren't scaling as fast as tech companies being able to maintain and build out a DMI strategy when they need a budget and people, and they're lacking all of those things at some point?
Should we make a plug for Diversity VC's Tech and Inclusion Toolkit, which our very own Victoria published last year. So that is precisely aimed to help organizations without a HR and inclusion system to do that. So yeah, please pick up a copy and leaf through. Great.
One thing that I really don't like that VCs do is when, I'm going to say it, is like what I call like secret recruiting, where just like associates just appear. So basically there are very few VC jobs.
Publicly, yeah.
Just by definition, and VC firms are very small. And so if, like me, you've been looking to get into the industry for a while, like the fact that, you know, maybe 50% of those are essentially invisible is extremely jarring. So yeah, any of you who do that, please stop.
We have time for one last question. Anyone want to ask a last question? Okay.
I don't think I need a microphone. So following what I kind of struggle with when you look for a VC analyst or maybe just looking at solutions being recently hired, I understand that VC has a diverse profile and we don't hire people based on certain sort of technical capabilities, but they all look the same. And they all sort of come from the same background and they appear. How do you, as someone who's looking, how do you stop yourself from going, okay, well, I'm not seeing anyone who looks like me who's been hired recently, this guy. Of got all your stats here, and they're great and they're wonderful, but and I'm also a researcher by day, right? So when I look through companies, I'm like, no one's here. Oh, but they've got one person that represents me, but that's it, and they're like 50 employees. How do you help someone stop themselves from applying based on what they see?
Yeah, I'll sort of say that because I literally was the person who was looking for pages and pages of private equity and VC pages, not seeing anyone who looked remotely like me, i.e. women or person of color. And something that has kept me going is stop looking for other people to give you permission to do what you want to do anyway, right? Like never, I've stopped asking for permission implicitly from people and just going and doing it. And I think if you're waiting around to sort of let people give you permission, you're never going to get that permission from them. So I guess my personal ethos is just to go and do it. Yeah.
I'm not from the industry, but I've been a diversity consultant for 18 years. And what Tunde just said struck a chord. If 50% of hires are coming through the back door to translate what...
It's not part of the metrics. Little disclaimer.
But it's anywhere near that, and then you think about, well, who's likely to be doing that recruitment, and what sort of people are they likely to be recruiting? Isn't fixing that a big part of the solution?
We certainly think so. I think it would be not to do, we built a platform specifically for that, and a lot of what we wanted to build was not only to remove the bias from the way that hiring takes place, so that you genuinely assess whether this is the right candidate to do the job based on their merits, but also to increase, I love what you said, Tunde, like to increase the level of transparency. It's awful how little is like exposed to the real world about the real jobs that most people want to do. So of course that also increases the more senior you go. And Tunde, I think it's probably fair to say most of the ones you never hear about, there might be the odd associate that gets in because they're like the nephew of someone or other, probably, but there's also even less transparency at senior levels, which I think explains a fair portion. And like, well, the pipeline problem that Travis showed earlier, which is that senior hires haven't become much more diverse, at least on gender terms, is partly explained by there's only 8 or 9 of them and they hire very infrequently, but it's also because they're even less likely to put those out to the open market. And so therefore your intermediary is exec search firms, which are thankfully increasingly feeling the pressure of companies coming back to them saying, please don't give me an all-white, all-male, all-Oxbridge slate. But nevertheless, it's still, they operate, their entire business model is who's in my network. And that network, as we've discussed, is extremely non-diverse. So it's a really, really tough problem to solve. And I think just the more pressure that you hear from outside is gonna help.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this is, to the point about the LPs, it's actually really hard to start your own fund. I mean, even if you've done, about half of the partners come in directly as entrepreneurs. If you're a junior, you're coming up, you want to start your own fund, it is incredibly difficult to get staked for your first fund. And you want to talk about not being able to do a friends and family round, try having enough personal runway to sort of do the fundraising, and then also the skin in the game, right? So the piece of work that we did was like minimum skin in the game is like 100,000, and that's after taxes, yeah? And you kind of have to have a place to live, and and that's hard. That's harder for some people than for the others. And LPs need to think about, are there other ways of ensuring sort of alignment that doesn't involve carry and quite that much upfront skin in the game? We don't know. By the way, if anyone has any answers to that, I'd be really, really happy to hear them. Because the current structure, there's actually not that much, for a very innovative sector, there's not that much innovation in how to run a venture capital fund.
But that is like one of the real limitations, I think, on the LP side, because it's interesting to me that, it's pretty hard to be a partner at a firm if you aren't already rich.
Oh, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, the cash flow requirements are insane. I mean, if you think about it, you're going to be investing around 1% of your fund typically in the first 3 years of your fund. If you're an early stage venture capital firm, you probably won't get exits until about year 8 or 9. You probably won't hit carry properly until a year or 2 after that. So you've got to be able to be 1% out of pocket for about 10 years. And if you think about a $200-300 million fund, you're talking about millions of dollars out of pocket. So it's a very simple bit of maths involved there.
And then try and throw in maternity leave, which doesn't exist.
Right, yeah. I mean, it compounds. Those things compound, and I think that's a major issue for startups. But that stops firms starting. What it doesn't answer and what it doesn't give an excuse to at all is existing firms hiring a more diverse base.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And on that note, where we think about firstly how to make more rich people happen so we can have more diverse funds, and also to sort of maybe perhaps ban the secret recruiting practice. I think that's a pretty good shout. I want to thank all the panelists for their time and insight today. That was fantastic. And thank you all for coming and joining us.
Envy you trying to fix it.
Just want to say one final thing, and I know it's kind of people from the amazing retailers and the drinks that have been put on very generously by SBB.
But just want to kind of give a bit of broader context about Diversity VC and what we're doing. And I know we've kind of mentioned the Future VC program a bit, but I don't know if everyone here knows actually what it is. But the Future VC program is one initiative that we're doing to encourage more diversity in the pipeline. And what that is actually, it's being run by Seb, who is in a wonderful, there he is at the back. And can everyone actually who's in the Future VC program put their hands up? These are all the amazing Future VCs who we've got here. Captive audience tonight, so if anyone who doesn't know about it, basically go and speak to these amazing people and to Seb. And we'd love to do this, I think, again, hopefully, Seb, if you're not completely traumatized, next year. And so if there's a fund in the room that wants to have a Future VC next year, come and find us. What it is a 5-week paid internship program with some of the top funds in the UK, and we've also got 10 interns joining us remotely. And it's just been fantastic, and people like Lillian and Saranga are teaching them centrally, so that there's kind of shared learnings, and they're a cohort, and they're also working on investment panel projects, being advised by Imran. So it's a massive team effort. And I guess that's kind of also what Diversity VC is in general. So so many people here in the room have been working with us for the last 3 years. Thank you so much, everyone. It's kind of evolved out of the industry, and it's amazing to have Saranga, one of our advisors here as well, and Alice, collaborators. So many people basically have kind of made this happen in various ways. So thank you. And then I think just one final thanks to Silicon Valley Bank for everything that you've done to make this possible. Please share the report on social media and everywhere, and kind of bring it along to meetings with you. And if you want to collaborate with us on something in the future, we would love to do that. Final word to Travis and to Lillian, who've been masterminding this whole thing. So thanks a lot again. Outside.
Yeah, let's go.
Please.
Thank you. I don't know, just leave it.